Hello and welcome to the program. My name is Michael Finney. Today I am joined by author John Slaughter. Would you like to say hello, sir?
Yeah, thanks for having me, and I appreciate the opportunity.
So let's jump right into it. We're going to find out about you, where you're from, anything you feel is important to tell us biographically so we can know you as a person.
Yeah, so I mean, the long and short of it, I guess, I'm in my late 30s and married. I got kids, all boys. I was in the Marine Corps for 5 years, and then decided that that was enough for me, and I went to college. Got a history degree that I don't use because apparently, unless you want to teach, it's kind of useless. Or go to law school, which I almost did, and then I kind of fell into finance, which is ironic because part of the reason I was a history major is I've never liked math. So
Funny how that works, right?
yeah, I realized I didn't want to teach, and then I fell into a position, and then kept working my way up, and realized, well, I got a fancy piece of paper on the wall, so I did. I got a history degree, and then got married right after college, had some kids, and I've lived in the South my whole life. That's another big thing, which I'm sure we'll get into because a lot of my writing takes place with that. But I was born in Texas, but I've lived in Alabama since I was about 7 years old. So I consider myself a native Alabamian.
Yeah, very nice. I feel like it's important to utilize our immediate surroundings and our experience in our writing. So let's start there. Let's ask you, where did you become interested in writing, or when did you become interested in writing? What have you written in the past? What is your experience like? Maybe tell us from the beginning.
Yeah, so I think my earliest sort of interactions with writing probably start, at a young age. I was the type of kid that just had a really overactive imagination. I would sit in class and daydream all the time. And that's one of those things where it can be detrimental. But as I got older, I kind of realized that sort of abstract thought and that constant imagination could be applied to creating things. And the first thing I actually ever wrote was, I think I was probably 16, and I'd forgot about this till a few years ago. My parents found it at their house, but I actually wrote what was a screenplay based on a Christmas. We had a Christmas out of town in Virginia, and it was one of those family events where everything that could go wrong goes wrong.
Classic.
Yeah, and sort of the worst and best of every different personalities interacting, and a lot of tension. And it was kind of comical, so I wrote it out as like a screenplay. And really, that was my first experience. But after that, I didn't touch writing until I was in college, really. And obviously, I was a history major, so I wrote a ton of academic papers. But I was always a reader, and I've always enjoyed literature, especially more literary fiction. Like I'm working my way through East of Eden right now, so I've always kind of stayed in that genre. And then one day, probably about 5 or 6 years ago, I decided to try my hand at fiction because I'd written nonfiction for so long, and I'd written political pieces. I've written some historical and opinion pieces for Abbeville Institute and other places, but I had never tried my hand at fiction. I sat down and started, just writing short stories. I had a couple of them published in the Double Dealer magazine, and then I finally decided, I'd always wanted to see my name up there next to, all the other books I keep on my shelf. So I just threw my hat in the ring. And for like the last 3 years, I kind of delved into trying to write a novel.
Very nice. So who are some of your favorite writers or books even?
Well, so my favorite writers, and this is probably cliche for a lot of guys my age, but I'm a huge Cormac McCarthy fan. I love Faulkner. Robert Penn Warren, Flannery O'Connor. I'm really deep into the Southern Gothic and the Southern tradition. So those are the authors that they're sort of my go-to. I've read most of all of their work, but even outside of the Southern tradition, I've enjoyed Dostoevsky. I've enjoyed Tolstoy. I read Anna Karenina last year, which was a task, but it was well worth it. So I kind of I try to, I don't know, I try to stick to the classics a lot of the time. And like I said, with the Southern Gothic tradition is really where I keep most my focus.
Do you feel like Cormac is in that classic pantheon at this point?
I think if he isn't, he will be. Now, we could talk about whether he's a Southern writer or not. He kind of dabbles, but he's definitely. I think in the next, I think by the time I'm in my 50s or 60s, he's going to be looked at as at least one of the great writers of the 20th century in America.
I think he's probably in that conversation now, though perhaps maybe not in the classic conversation because he's so contemporary. We only lost him kind of recently. So, and then additionally, like his stuff getting turned into films, I think over the last 20 years or so, that seems relevant now still, right? What in his lifetime?
Yeah, and I'm thinking when I say he'll reach that point, I think is more that we'll see academic, instead of seeing depending on how the universities play out over the future, but I could see him being featured in literature courses throughout academia, in the near future.
Sure.
I think right now amongst readers and writers, he's already there, but I think we might see him be introduced or have people introduced to his work through college in the near future.
Potentially, yeah. I would guess there are some Cormac McCarthy classes or even curriculums, syllabi that have him featured on it. Would not surprise me in the least.
Yeah, I never encountered it, but maybe I'm dating myself a little bit.
That's okay.
I didn't take literature in college either, though, so that could be it.
There's historical literature.
That's true, but I when it comes to the literature sort of sphere, I'm more of an autodidact on that. I didn't.
That's all right.
I didn't dabble in it. In the university, my focus was actually American history, and then my European was focused on German history. So,
yeah, very cool. So let's jump into what you were talking about in regards to getting around to fiction, beginning to write fiction, wanting to throw your hat into the circle, right? Let's say, or you said about years ago, you started working on your book, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. So what was let's use the literary term. What was the inciting incident that made you want to get into writing fiction at that exact moment?
Well, there was a couple of things at play. I think the biggest catalyst was the fact that, I've mentioned earlier, I have sons, and I realized, I'd consume media with them, watch movies or read stuff. And I realized there was a significant lack of modern, what I would consider sort of masculine, more traditional media and literature, right? Especially considering literature, like we would go to Barnes and Noble or local bookstore, and there's very few things geared towards young boys and young men. And so I started thinking about the types of stories that inspired me as a kid and the power of storytelling, because I am a firm believer that most people, they form their conceptions about the world through stories. And the example I'll always use is if you ask the average person about William Wallace, they do not think about William Wallace as a historical character. They think of William Wallace from Braveheart. They think of Mel Gibson's portrayal. That informs everything they think about him, generally speaking. And so I think understanding that, you understand the power of narrative, the power of literature, of myth. And so I wanted to be able to try to tell stories that could kind of speak to young men and boys as well. And so what I first did was I originally had started working on a it was sort of a mythological retell. It was basically the Odyssey set in post Civil War Alabama, and it was involving, because there used to be river pirates down here at one point, and I started on that, and then I kind of walked away from it, and that was really the first thing that I started on. But then I realized how much I enjoyed creating and building these stories, and so from there, I gradually played with a few more, and then the second sort of phase in that was, I'm a Catholic, and I've always had a problem with Christian media because it's very, I don't think it speaks to the reality of the world and the darkness and the problems we encounter. So I wanted to tell stories that touched on themes of redemption, or sin and stuff like that. And I looked at, my favorite film genre growing up as a kid was noir, because I grew up with my grandparents and we watched a lot of Humphrey Bogart films. And so I thought noir was the perfect sort of vehicle for being able to tell stories about flawed people who could be redeemed. And I think that's an important theme for everybody, but especially young men. And then that was sort of what got me going that direction.
Interesting. I have recently been watching the old Batman series, the serial series from like the 40s. Have you ever seen any of that stuff?
I don't think I've seen the oldest one I think I've seen is the Adam West, which was the 60s, right?
Yeah, and that one's super camp. Which now, when you kind of go back and watch even the 80s and 90s films, we're kind of as far away from those at this point as those films were from the Adam West run in its era. They look sort of, I don't want to say corny, but they feel more campy at this point than perhaps they did when they were originally coming out. But I digress. Let's get back to the 40s series. I think for you as a fan of noir, you might be interested in some of that stuff because it is fairly serious and also a nice combination of that character and that time frame and that setting through the lens of the noir lens, let's say. And it I don't think that a lot of people have seen it, that stuff. I certainly had not before recently, and it was sort of like this like missing link, missing bit of almost near lost media, perhaps. I know that it exists and things, but like I feel like because it started coming out in 43, I think that it was probably very popular and very influential within its context and time that most of us don't really know about. There's also, because it's kind of early in his existence as a character, a lot of his rogues gallery doesn't exist, and it leans on the more traditional noir storytelling and opposition, the bad guy characters, so to speak.
It almost sounds like it's Batman with like Dick Tracy villains.
To a degree, yeah, right. He's leaning more into his detective side of things, which, Detective Comics, and also you see that stuff in noir very, very regularly, the private eye protagonist and things like that. And I think if you haven't seen it, you might be interested. Maybe you aren't. Maybe you don't like comic book characters or Batman at all, and I've just been raving to you. But if you do,
you're good.
It's a weird bit of stuff that I feel like most people haven't seen, but it is, an interesting example of the genre made in that time period.
Would you say it's more similar to the recent Robert Pattinson Batman than any of the others?
I would in general.
Have you seen that one?
I have.
Okay.
Though when I would actually put it more in the Christian Bale side of things
Okay.
than Robert Pattinson, because there's some undercurrents in the Pattinson material that I think people haven't necessarily latched onto, or maybe are kind of glossing over a little bit because it's fresh and visually arresting. It's beautiful. The cinematography is really great on that film. However, the take on Batman and Bruce Wayne, to me, inside of that film, he's actually one of the least important elements of the film in the grand scheme of things. I'm not saying he's bad. I'm just saying he's not really driving the story in any real sense.
That makes it. Well, we won't turn into a Batman episode, but I will say this: I'm a big fan of the first and second act. I hate the third act of that film, but I just didn't care for the ending. I really just it lost me after they get to the stadium. I didn't really care for that part.
Interesting. I didn't dislike it. I think that it elevates him in terms of being a hero, but it's the big action sequence of the film. But by that point, the actual, spoiler alert here for anybody who hasn't seen it yet, the actual Riddler is already sort of out of commission by that point. So it's a little bit, perhaps it's anticlimactic. Who's to say?
Well, I like the atmosphere of it because it is it took me back to the more noir roots to a degree of Batman, the darkness, the focus on the detective work, which I think some of the other films kind of miss. They definitely miss them in the Tim Burton and the Schumacher films.
Yeah. Oh yeah. 100%. Totally agree. Let's dive into your debut release, Crimson Veil.
That was released on, it's been a week now, so on ebook, paperback, hardback. It is a story. It is sort of a classic noir story, but it's what I would like to call Southern noir, as much as that, insofar as that's even a genre. But it follows a character named J.D. Hooks who is returned home after his father's passing, and in classic noir fashion is roped into a ongoing mystery by, sort of the enigmatic woman who kind of wanders into his office, and he's kind of drug into that. And as he's pursuing this this mystery and trying to unravel what's going on in this town, it's really him dealing with returning home, and sort of it's almost what I tried to do was do a combination of genre fiction and literary fiction. So as much as it is a noir novel, it's also more character driven, and it's about Hooks as a character trying to deal with the sins of his father and what it means, what redemption means, and what it costs to be redeemed.
Very nice. I'm just pulling it up. So it looks like you've got it available in ebook, paperback, and hardcover. Did you do the layout? Did you bring someone in to do that? Tell us about your experience in producing it.
Yeah, I designed that all myself. I sat down. I had looked around at having somebody do it for me, and then I started playing around with just doing designs. In the meantime, I was waiting for people to get back, and I started what I kind of had envisioned as I was doing it was I wanted to kind of call back to some of the older novels that I had seen as a kid, in the library. Some of the older, Raymond Chandler novels, or even some older Southern novels that were sort of a simple and darker sort of cover. And as I was playing with it, I sent it to a few people, and they really liked it. So I said, well, you know what? I'll watch a couple of YouTube videos on how to actually create a cover, and I went for it myself. The only thing I didn't do was my wife did change the color. The original cover was a brighter red, which we went with crimson, so I'll give her credit on that.
Props to your wife. Good decision, right?
Yeah, no, she has an eye for that kind of thing. I'm I'm not a visual artist, so I'm glad it turned out well. But that was my first attempt at that.
I feel like the crimson red was kind of staring you in the face. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, it probably should have been kind of obvious, but I went with a bright, like almost like candy apple red, and my wife was like, "No, don't do that." So I'm glad I listened to her.
Maybe she has a future in publishing as well. We'll see.
I don't know. She's an artist. She can draw just about anything. So I'm glad the cover turned out well. People seem to like it, and considering that's not my forte. Maybe next time I'll get somebody else to do it though, because this feels like a lot of pressure.
I don't know. It's nice. It's clean. It's simple. 3 colors. Usually, I say in terms of design, you kind of like want one primary color, maybe a secondary color, black and white. You've got that going on. So I think you nailed it. Maybe you're being a little too hard on yourself.
Well, a broken clock is right twice a day, so you never know.
What should we expect out of Crimson Veil, not only as a standalone release, but perhaps there's more? Is this something that we should expect the characters to return from? I don't want you to spoil anything if you don't want to. Should we think that maybe you have a follow-up release in you at some point, related or not? Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it works really well as a standalone novel. As far as what to expect from it, I think if you're a fan of noir, I always tell people if you're a fan of the first season of True Detective, that's kind of the feel of the novel itself. So that's kind of what you can expect out of it. It's a darker tone with a little bit of heavier philosophical concepts kind of thrown in there. So it's not it's an easy read, and it can be more than that if you want it to. So I think you can kind of get what you want out of it. As far as follow ups, I've actually toyed with the idea. I don't know if you're familiar with McCarthy's Border trilogy. But in that, he has, All the Pretty Horses, The Crossing, Cities on the Plain. The first 2 books, All the Pretty Horses and The Crossing, have 2 different protagonists and can be read in any order. And those protagonists are then together in Cities on the Plain. And so I'm thinking what the follow-up to this will probably be is it will probably take place in the same town which is it's a fictional town that I created, with some of the same characters as a sequel. So maybe not a direct sequel, but sort of like a B-side or something. I don't know what you describe it as, but like a sequel that takes place within the same world with similar characters.
A shared universe, even.
Yeah, because I'm kind of obviously drawing inspiration from what Faulkner did with creating his own fictional county. And a lot of this story, if anyone is interested, is based loosely on the events and the time, events, a series of years in a town in Alabama called Phoenix City that was a town that was run by the Dixie Mafia. So I did a bunch of research on that years ago and found it fascinating. And so a lot of that is sort of the inspiration for this novel.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah, I think if it's an interesting world because that town was a town that was completely run by what they called the Dixie Mafia, and it wasn't like Chicago or New York where you had areas that were controlled. The whole city, to the point that they laundered the money in the courthouse basement. They picked who the sheriff was. They picked who ran for office in the city. Everything ran through them. And so I used that sort of as an inspiration and created a fictional town with a similar structure. And I think there's a lot of room for that. And I may capitalize on that, like I said, with sort of a shared universe sequel, but then maybe bring back the story full circle in a third book by combining the first two.
I like it. I like the thinking. I like the potential progress that you would make in building out that fictional space. So let's round things out. Are there any things we don't know about you, your writing experience, what you're working on that we should know, or things that you wanted to say but didn't get the opportunity to speak about so far?
Well, no, I think the first thing is, I'm always working on short stories, which usually I try to submit them to the Double Dealer, which anyone doesn't know, it's a literary magazine that publishes a lot of short fiction. They do a lot of great work, so I kind of throw off a lot of my one-off stories into that.
Yeah, we like the Double Dealer. We've had TR Hudson on the
Okay,
program.
yeah. So I mean, they published my first ever a short story I've ever written, and that probably I got a lot of good feedback. So I kind of thank them for sort of keeping me on track with doing this. But yeah, I mean, I want anybody who goes out and reads it. I want them to enjoy it, and I want them to be able to kind of be transported to that older world, because I think there's a lot in there. Um, there's a lot to be gleaned from that to that sort of that time period that I think is somewhat reminiscent of what's going on now in our world, and I want them to be able to enjoy it, and hopefully, it inspires to a sequel. And then I do plan at some point to write this mythological sort of odyssey through the South, because that's sort of my big project in the future. Because I think myth is important, and I want to kind of marry the old Greek myths with sort of the North American mythology as well. So that's something I'm really working on, and I'm excited about. But I'm worried I'm going to be like Faust, and I'm going to be like Goethe writing Faust. I'm going to be like 70 by the time I finish it.
Hey, it takes as long as it takes. I feel like, we had something similar to that. What was it? Oh, brother, where art thou?
Right. Yeah. Oh, Brother, Where Art Thou was sort of a retelling of the Odyssey. A little looser. The
Sure.
story that I'm working on is and I had finished the first. It's a father and son, and the father goes missing, and the son goes to find him. And as he gets onto the river, he sort of ends up in Odysseus's place, where he's just traveling and encountering a series of mythological. To give an example of what I was doing with it, I had a whole section that I had written out where instead of the lotus eaters, they come upon a cabin that has like pecan pie, right? And that takes place of the lotus. So I'm kind of pulling it in that way, if that makes sense.
It can, who amongst us haven't been drunk on pecan pie at some point?
Well, and plus there's river pirates, which if anybody doesn't know about that, that's a fun rabbit hole to go down. There were river pirates here, and that was something I just think is really lacking in a lot of fiction.
I do have an appreciation for the phrase river pirates, which conceptually I'm seeing it. Functionally, there's kind of only two ways to get away on a river, right?
Right. Yeah. A lot of the river pirates took place in the even really pre-Civil War, back when before they had the steamboats, and you would take what's called a flatboat, and a flatboat it was a one-way trip. So you were upriver, you load it with everything, and you go, and they would hide out in little areas, and they would then hijack the boat, and steal everything. There's not really anywhere you can go at that point.
Sure, interesting. Well, hey, John, I appreciate you taking the time telling us about Crimson Veil, your writing experience, and all the rest to learn about you today.
Yeah, man, I really appreciate you having me and giving me the opportunity to come on and put a spotlight on my novel.
Absolutely. Congrats on the debut release, and we'll be looking for more.
Sounds good. Thanks.